Somebody laughed before the sun was all the way up. Then another voice followed it. Then a third. By the time the pickup truck rolled past the Carter orchard that morning, the whole thing had already become a joke. Because there, on her knees in the cold dirt, wearing an old denim work jacket with white paint on both sleeves, was 16-year-old Naomi Carter, and she was painting apple trees. Not the fence, not the barn, not the gate, the trees. Every trunk in the orchard was turning white from the ground to the first branches, bright and chalky against the dark bark. And a grown man in the passenger seat leaned out of the truck window and shouted, "Girl, what in the world are you doing?" Naomi did not look up. She dipped her brush back into the bucket and kept painting. Another man laughed and called across the road, "That tree is not your color book, girl." The men in the truck howled. Naomi kept painting. By noon, 3 more trucks had slowed down to stare. By evening, the joke was already at the diner. And by Sunday, half the county had decided that Elijah Carter's daughter had lost her mind. But what nobody asked that week, not one of those laughing men, not the women whispering after church, not even the county orchard advisor himself, was the only question that mattered. What did Naomi Carter see in those trees that every grown farmer around her had missed? If you've ever seen something others missed while they laughed at you, subscribe. Because this is that kind of story. Now let me take you back to where it really started. Naomi Carter had inherited more than an orchard. She had inherited an unfinished question. Her father, Elijah Carter, had died 18 months earlier in late February, just before pruning season. He had been walking the South Row at first light, checking winter bark split on a pair of young Honeycrisps, when the pain hit him. By the time Ruth got him to the truck, it was too late. 1 minute he was a man with dirt on his boots and pruning shears in his coat pocket. The next minute, he was a memory. He left behind 9 acres of apple trees, a weathered red barn, a widow trying not to break in front of her daughter, and a 16-year-old girl the county had already decided was too young to know what to do with any of it. The Carter orchard sat on the colder edge of the valley, where wind moved sharp in winter and settled hard in the low places after sunset. Elijah had spent years trying to build a reputation for clean fruit. Not the biggest orchard in the county, not the wealthiest, but steady, careful, honest fruit. And year after year he had the same problem. Some of the trees would make it through winter looking fine. Then spring would come, and a few would show long bark cracks, soft dead patches, or split sections on one side of the trunk. Some would leaf out weak. Some would struggle all summer. Some would die outright. Everybody said the same thing. Bad winter. Just happens. Part of farming. Elijah said that too, at least out loud. But Naomi knew he was never satisfied with that answer, because when she was little, her father had taught her something simple. "If a tree keeps telling you the same thing," he'd say, tapping the trunk with 2 fingers, "then stop guessing and listen." Naomi listened. Most people remembered Elijah as a hard-working man. Naomi remembered him as a noticing man. He noticed when leaves curled differently on one side of the row than the other. He noticed when fruit set heavier on the north edge after a mild winter. He noticed bark, bud swelling, branch angle, soil moisture, and wind. And Naomi had learned to notice beside him. Every morning before school, she would walk part of the orchard with him. He never called it a lesson. He just asked questions. "What do you see on this trunk? Why's this side darker? Which row thawed first yesterday? What changed since Monday?" Most people thought he was simply letting his daughter tag along. He was really teaching her how to look. After he died, that habit stayed with her. She started rising before daylight and walking the rows alone. At first, it was grief more than work. The orchard was the last place she still felt close to him, but grief turned into attention, and attention turned into a pattern. Naomi carried a small spiral notebook in the back pocket of her jeans. Inside it, she drew rows and tree numbers the way her father used to do on loose paper scraps. Tree 1 through tree 186. Rootstock notes, bud condition, bark condition, south row wind exposure, old scars, late thaw patches. She wrote down the things most people walked past. The first winter after Elijah died, 4 more trees were damaged. 1 died by June. The next winter, 3 more showed splitting bark and weak push. Everybody around them blamed cold. Naomi did too at first. But one night, with the kitchen lamp on and a cup of tea growing cold beside her elbow, she spread her father's old orchard map flat on the table and marked every tree that had been damaged over the last few years. Then she sat back, and the feeling that came over her wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The trees weren't random, the damage wasn't scattered, and the bark splits weren't all over the trunk the way random winter injuries should have been. Again and again they were on the same side, the southwest side, the side that caught the low afternoon winter sun. Naomi looked at the page for a long time. Then she pulled the notebook closer and wrote one sentence. If the same side keeps dying, then winter alone is not the whole answer. That was the beginning, not certainty, just a better question. And sometimes that is how truth starts, not with a big discovery, just with one person refusing to be satisfied by the lazy explanation everybody else is repeating. Naomi began reading at night, anything she could get her hands on. Old orchard bulletins, extension pamphlets, fruit growing guides, cold injury notes, apple bark management, late dormancy behavior. She read words she had to sound out slowly. She looked up terms she didn't know. She copied sentences into her notebook and translated them into plain English. Some nights Ruth would come into the kitchen long after dark and find her still there with papers spread all over the table, pencil in hand, reading like a girl studying for an exam nobody else knew existed. One evening, Ruth asked, "What are you looking for exactly?" Naomi turned the notebook around and pointed to the marked trunks. "They're not splitting everywhere," she said. "It's the same side over and over." Ruth leaned in. "What does that mean?" Naomi answered honestly. "I don't know yet, but it means it's something." A week later, she found it. Not in a dramatic flash, not in one perfect sentence, but in a handful of overlapping explanations from orchard management notes and a university paper from a cold region apple program. Sun scald, southwest injury, winter trunk warming. Dark bark absorbs heat from winter sun. The living tissue beneath wakes slightly. Temperature crashes after sunset. That active tissue freezes and dies. Bark splits, cambium damage, trunk injury, weak spring push. The more she read, the more it fit. Same side, same type of injury, same pattern. And then came the detail that made everybody laugh later. One of the simplest protections listed again and again was white trunk coating. Paint or whitewash, because white reflects sunlight. It keeps the trunk from warming too much in winter, which helps keep the tissue dormant, which helps prevent that freeze-thaw injury. Naomi read that paragraph 3 times. Then she read it again out loud to her mother. Ruth looked at her daughter, then at the trees outside the window gone dark in the evening. "You're telling me paint helps by keeping the tree colder?" Naomi nodded. Ruth gave a little half-laugh of surprise. "That sounds backwards." "I know," Naomi said, "but it makes sense, doesn't it?" Ruth thought for a moment. Then she said the words that changed everything. "If you believe it, try it." That was all. No speech, no dramatic blessing. just trust. The kind of trust that matters most when the whole world is preparing to laugh at you. Naomi drove to the farm supply store on a Thursday morning before first light. The man at the counter, Roy Lemons, knew exactly who she was. Everybody did. He watched her set gallon after gallon of white exterior latex paint on the counter and raised both eyebrows. "You painting the barn?" he asked. Naomi said, "No, sir." Roy smiled. "Fence?" "No, sir." He looked at the stack again. "Then what's all this for?" Naomi counted out her money. "For the trees." Roy waited for the punchline. None came. Naomi picked up 2 cans, carried them outside, and came back for more. By the second trip, Roy had already turned the story over in his mind, the way people do when they know before lunch they're going to have something amusing to tell. Naomi loaded the truck and drove home. She started the next morning before sunrise. Bucket, brush, gloves, notebook in her back pocket. She scraped soil back from the base of the first tree and brushed the white paint upward in slow, even strokes. The bark disappeared beneath the white. Then the next tree. Then the next. By the time the sky turned silver over the orchard, she had finished the first row, and the first truck slowed down. By 9 o'clock, a pair of men had parked by the road just long enough to laugh. By noon, word was spreading. By evening, the story had already reached Harlan Pike. Now, Harlan Pike was the kind of man whose opinion traveled farther than most people's facts. He ran the largest orchard operation in the county. More acreage, more workers, better equipment, a sign by the road. People listened when he talked because success makes some men look like experts, even when they've stopped noticing anything new. He drove out the next day. Naomi was on her knees beside a young Fuji tree when his truck pulled up. He leaned on the gate and watched her paint for a while without saying anything. Then he laughed. Not loud at first. Worse than loud, really. Easy. Comfortable. The laugh of a man who has already decided he is looking at foolishness. "Well," he said, "I've seen all kinds of things in an orchard, but this one's new." Naomi kept working. Harlan nodded toward the trunk. "You think paint grows apples, girl?" "No, sir," Naomi said. He waited. She didn't explain further. That bothered him more than if she had argued. Harlan tried again. "Your daddy worked these trees 15 years and never once painted them white." Naomi stood up slowly, brush in one hand. Then she said, "My daddy also lost trees every winter." The silence that followed was not a friendly one. Harlan's mouth tightened. "You saying you know more than he did?" Naomi answered carefully. "I'm saying I kept looking at what kept killing them." Harlan stared at her for a moment like he was deciding whether to laugh again or be offended. In the end, he did both. "Well," he said, climbing back into the truck, "when you get tired of turning apple trees into fence posts, maybe come by and I'll show you how real growers do it." Then he drove away, and by supper the whole county had heard. The diner got hold of the story and wouldn't let it go. Men repeated it over coffee. Women heard it secondhand and shook their heads. A couple of the boys from school drove past the orchard just to see if it was true. One of them yelled out the truck window, "That tree is not your color book, girl." By Sunday afternoon, that line had become the joke everybody used. Even folks who didn't mean Naomi personal harm repeated it because mockery is easy entertainment when the target is young, quiet, and different. And Naomi was all three. Worse, she was a black girl in a county where some people had long ago decided what kind of person was supposed to teach and what kind was supposed to listen. They would not have said that cleanly out loud. Most people never do. They dress it up as common sense, experience, tradition, knowing your place. But Naomi felt it all the same. She felt it when grown men addressed their questions to her mother, even when Naomi was the one doing the orchard work. She felt it when people called her that Carter girl in the same tone they used for foolishness. She felt it when they laughed before asking why. One afternoon in town, Naomi stood beside the truck while Ruth went inside the feed store. Two older men sat on the bench out front talking in voices just loud enough to be heard. One said, "Shame Elijah's orchard ended up in the hands of a child." The other answered, "Not just a child, a girl with a paint bucket." They both chuckled. Then the first added, "That place will be sold inside 2 years." Naomi held still. The second man looked right at her and shrugged like it didn't matter whether she heard him or not. "Some people are just not built for orchard work." Naomi knew what he meant. She also knew there was no argument that would reach two men who had already decided who she was. So she got in the truck and said nothing. That night, Ruth found her out in the shed washing brushes. "You don't have to prove anything to those people," Ruth said softly. Naomi didn't look up. "I know." Ruth waited. "Then who are you doing it for?" Naomi rinsed the brush carefully, watching white swirl into the water. "For the trees," she said. Then, after a moment, she added, "And for Daddy." A week later, the county orchard advisor came out. His name was Doyle Prentice, and he had worked orchards longer than Naomi had been alive. He carried a clipboard, wore clean boots, and had the settled confidence of a man who expected to be right before he arrived. He stepped into the first row, knocked a knuckle lightly against one of the painted trunks, and frowned at the white residue on his fingers. "So," he said, not looking at Naomi, "this is the famous paint project." Naomi stood beside him, notebook in hand. "Yes, sir." Mr. Prentice walked 2 more rows. He asked a few questions, but in the way adults sometimes ask children questions when they are really only waiting for their own turn to speak. Finally, he stopped near tree 19. "What made you do this?" Naomi answered plainly. "I think the winter injury is from sun warming the bark on the southwest side. Then the temperature drops and kills the tissue." Prentice finally looked at her. "And where exactly did you get that idea?" "I mapped the damaged trees," Naomi said. "It's the same side again and again." Then I started reading. He gave a short smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Reading?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the trunk again and said, "Cold injury is complicated. People oversimplify it. Paint is not a miracle." I didn't say it was. Prentice scribbled something on his clipboard. Then he tapped 2 nearby young trees with his pen. "These 2 are weak. I'd probably remove them after the season." Naomi looked up into the branches. The buds were firm. The wood didn't look dead. "They're not finished," she said. Prentice gave a little laugh. "Young lady, I've been doing this a very long time." Naomi said nothing. He continued, "You'll learn that books and fields are not the same thing." Then he turned to Ruth, who had come up from the house. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd recommend you have someone with more experience keep an eye on this place." Naomi felt the words land harder than the mockery, because those words were not laughter. They were dismissal, dressed as expertise. After he left, she opened the notebook and wrote exactly what he had said about the 2 trees. Then, beneath it, she wrote, "Check both weekly. Do not remove unless the evidence changes. Tell me in the comments, if you saw a girl painting apple trees white, would you think she was foolish? Or would you wait to see why?" Spring came slowly that year. The orchard stayed colder longer than usual, which worried everybody except Naomi. Then the buds swelled. Then the blossoms opened. And for the first time in years, the Carter orchard looked unusually even. Rows of white trunks stood beneath clouds of bloom. Tree after tree pushed strong. The 2 young trees Prentice had quietly written off showed healthy growth. Naomi recorded everything: bloom density, branch vigor, bark condition, southwest face healing. She did not celebrate too early. That was one of the habits she had inherited from her father, too. Good growers do not fall in love with one promising week. They wait. Still, the county noticed. People who had laughed before now slowed their trucks and stared a little longer. Nobody apologized. Nobody said, "Maybe we judged too fast." But the tone changed. Mockery softened into curiosity. Curiosity, however, is not the same thing as respect. That summer, the orchard set fruit clean and strong. Even Ruth noticed it. "These trees look better," she said one evening while standing at the end of the center row. Naomi nodded. The bark stayed sound. Ruth smiled. "You were right then." Naomi looked over the orchard a long moment before answering. "Maybe." Ruth gave her a puzzled look. Naomi said, "One season isn't enough to prove it." That was how she thought. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to understand the truth. And truth, unlike pride, can survive being tested. By late August, the Carter orchard had one of its cleanest harvests in years. Fruit quality was up. Losses were down. The buyer noticed. Harlan Pike noticed too, though he said nothing. And if the story had ended there, it would already have been enough to shame a few people. But the real test had not come yet, because what Naomi had solved was only half the problem. She just didn't know it yet. The next winter began wrong. December came soft and stayed soft. Days ran too warm. The orchard smelled faintly green in weather that should have fell to sleep. Naomi noticed it before most people did. One morning on her dawn walk, she stopped at a row of younger trees and leaned closer to the buds. They had swollen slightly. Too early, not much, but enough. The warm spell had started teasing the orchard awake. That night, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and wrote, "If dormancy breaks too early, paint may not be enough." The problem terrified her for one simple reason. Paint protected the trunk from winter sun heating, but it could not stop a whole orchard from waking early if the weather itself turned warm for too long. Then the forecast changed. A hard front was moving south. Temperatures were expected to crash, not just cold, brutal cold. The kind that ruins orchards, the kind people remember for years. Naomi read the forecast twice, then a third time. Ruth saw her face. "What is it?" Naomi turned the paper around. "If the buds and cambium wake up too much before this hits." She didn't finish. Ruth didn't need her to. The next morning, the temperature began dropping. By nightfall, it was below freezing. By dawn, it had dropped far lower than expected. Naomi stood on the porch in the dark, looked out at the rows of white trunks, and for the first time since she picked up that brush, she was afraid. The orchard looked quiet, but quiet orchards can be full of danger. She walked row by row, lantern in one hand, bare fingers pressing lightly against the bark. The first morning, everything still felt firm. The second morning, too. By the third, she found a soft patch on one young tree in the south row, then another. Then, 2 rows later, she found what she had feared most. Tree 19. Her father's first Honeycrisp. A low patch on the southwest side had gone soft beneath the bark. Naomi stood very still with her hand flat against that trunk. She did not cry. She did not speak. She just stood there in the cold and let the truth settle. The paint had helped. But the paint was not enough. She had been right, and also not right enough. That is a hard thing for anybody to accept. Harder still when you have already spent a year being mocked for believing in your solution. She went inside, opened the notebook, and wrote the hardest line she had ever written. The white paint protects against sun scald. It does not fully protect against deep freeze after a premature wake-up. Needs second layer of protection. Then she closed the notebook and got back up. Because truth is only useful if you are willing to adjust when it corrects you. Naomi drove into town that same morning and bought every roll of burlap the feed store had in stock. The man loading it into the truck asked, "What are you doing with all this?" Naomi said, "Wrapping trees." He blinked once, then laughed like maybe he thought she was joking. She wasn't. She went back home and started with the youngest rows first. Burlap around lower trunks. Extra mulch at the base. Windward side protection where needed. Careful wrapping. Not rushed. Not random. Not desperate. Methodical. The work went on for days in biting cold. By afternoon, her fingers would go stiff. By evening, she could barely close her hands around a fork at supper. Ruth watched her daughter come in each night raw with cold and worry. One night, she set a bowl of stew down in front of Naomi and said quietly, "Your father would not want you freezing yourself half to death over those trees." Naomi flexed her aching hands once. Then she answered without anger. "Daddy lost too many because he didn't know what was happening soon enough. I know more now. I have to do something with that." Ruth stood there a moment. Then she placed one hand lightly on Naomi's shoulder and let her eat. Out on the roads, the county saw a new spectacle. First, the black girl had painted her apple trees white. Now she was wrapping them in burlap. The laughter came roaring back. At the diner, somebody said she was dressing the orchard for winter like it was a line of children. Another said the girl had finally gone completely strange. Harlan Pike heard all of it. So did Mr. Prentice. Neither one came by to help. Neither one came by to ask what she had discovered. They only watched. And sometimes that is the sharpest form of pride. Watching someone struggle, just in case they fail where you predicted they would. Stay with me, because the frost that came next did not just test Naomi's orchard. It tested every person who had laughed at her. The front settled over the valley and stayed. Night after night, the temperatures held low, the kind of cold that makes metal sting and dry wood crack. Naomi checked the orchard every morning before light, notebook in one hand, lantern in the other, touching bark, examining buds, marking damage, waiting. The valley held its breath. Neighboring orchards started showing injury. First a few split sections, then darkened bark, then weak spring push. The same men who had laughed a year earlier now began pacing their own rows with the tight faces of people, discovering that nature does not care how certain they sounded at the diner. When the freeze finally broke and the valley edged towards spring, the truth came slowly. Then, all at once, the Carter orchard had damage, but far less than expected. A handful of young trees showed stress. A couple needed cutting back. And tree 19, her father's tree, never fully recovered. It leafed thin, set weak, and by midsummer Naomi knew she was going to lose it. That cut deep. Because even being right does not save you from every loss. But the rest of the orchard held better than most anybody thought it would. Held better than some larger, richer orchards in the county. Held well enough that when bloom came, Naomi knew before anybody else that the season had shifted in her favor. The bloom was even. The bark was sound. The push was clean. And the same county that had laughed at her paint bucket and her burlap now drove past her rows a little slower, not joking anymore. By harvest, the difference was impossible to miss. Neighboring orchards had lost fruit. Some lost trees. Some carried scarred trunks and reduced sets. The Carter orchard produced clean apples, not perfect, but strong. Strong enough to silence people. and silence after a year of laughter can sound like justice. Naomi cut down tree 19 in August. She waited as long as she could. Too long, probably. But people hold on longer when what they are losing is not just wood. It was her father's favorite tree, the first Honeycrisp he planted, the tree he used to stop beside while talking to her as if it were an old friend, the tree she had always checked first, the tree she had hoped most to save. When she finally carried the saw out there, the morning was quiet and hot. She stood in front of the trunk a long while before pulling the cord. Then she made the cut clean. Fast, respectful, the way hard work deserves to end. Afterward, she stood over the stump with the saw hanging in one hand and didn't move for a full minute. Nobody came over. Some things a person has to finish alone. That night, she opened the notebook to the first page and taped a small photograph of tree 19 inside the cover. Then beneath it, she wrote, "This tree taught me that half right is not enough. Keep looking. Keep learning." That line mattered because the story was never going to be, "She guessed once and got lucky." The story was, she observed, tested, adjusted, lost something, learned more, and kept going. That is what made her strong. Not being instantly right. Being willing to keep learning after the evidence proved her incomplete. The moment of reversal did not happen in the diner. It happened in the orchard. A few weeks into picking season, Naomi was halfway up a ladder with a canvas bag against her hip when she heard a truck roll slowly down the lane. She looked over. Harlan Pike. He parked, stepped out, and stood for a minute with both hands on his belt, looking across the rows of white trunks. Then he walked toward her. Naomi climbed down from the ladder and waited. Harlan took off his hat. Not dramatically. Just enough to show he had not come to laugh this time. He looked past her at the orchard, then back at her. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. Naomi said nothing. Harlan rubbed a thumb along the brim of his hat, a man searching for words he didn't enjoy needing. "The paint," he said at last. "Does the brand matter?" Naomi held his gaze a second. Then she answered him the same way she wished somebody had once answered her, plainly without making him pay for the question. "Not much. White matters more than brand. Young trunks do better if the mix is thin some. Full coverage to the lower branches, and if warm spells wake the trees early, the paint helps, but wrap the younger ones too." Harlan listened. Then, to Naomi's surprise, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the same kind he had mocked her for carrying. And he wrote it down. There are moments in life that arrive quietly, but change the meaning of everything that came before. This was one of those moments. No apology, no speech, just a grown man writing down the advice of the black girl he had laughed at. When he finished, Harlan closed the notebook and cleared his throat. "Your daddy would have been proud of this crop," he said. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back to the truck. Naomi watched him drive away. She did not smile. Not right then. She just turned and went back to picking. Because the thing she had wanted most was never his apology. It was proof. And now the proof was hanging heavy on the branches all around her. The laughter stopped that year. Not all at once, but enough. One man tried paint the following winter, then another. Then a neighbor asked about burlap wraps for younger trunks. A local grower quietly started checking Southwest bark on his own orchard. 2 years later, half the valley had some variation of white trunks in winter. And nobody called it foolish anymore. That is how it often goes. What people mock first, they copy later. But they rarely remember the name of the person who paid the price of being laughed at first. The Carters remembered. Ruth remembered. Naomi remembered. And the orchard remembered too in the only way orchards do, by living longer under better care. Naomi kept her notebooks, every mistake, every correction, every damage map, every weather note, every lesson learned at the cost of time, pride, or trees. Years later, Ruth would tell visitors that the most valuable thing on the property was not the orchard itself. It was the stack of notebooks tied with twine in a cabinet near the kitchen, because those notebooks held something rarer than easy success. They held the record of somebody learning honestly, and honesty is harder to find than confidence. Here is the part that stays with me. Naomi Carter did not win because she was loud. She did not win because she humiliated people back. She did not win because she had more money, more land, more workers, or more years than anybody around her. She won because she kept looking. She let the trees tell her the truth. She took the risk of looking foolish. And when the truth corrected her, she changed with it instead of defending her pride. That alone would make this a strong story. But there is another layer to it, because the county did not laugh only because the trees were painted white. They laughed because of who was holding the brush. A black girl, a young black girl. Somebody many of them had already filed away in their minds as a person too young to teach them, too quiet to matter, too outside the circle to be right before the evidence forced them to admit it. And that is the cruelest thing prejudice does. It does not just insult people. It blinds the proud. It keeps them from seeing wisdom because they have already decided what wisdom is supposed to look like. Naomi's orchard exposed that. The frost exposed that. The harvest exposed that. Because in the end, the real test was never just the trees. The real test was whether the people around her could allow a girl like Naomi to be right before nature made it undeniable. For a long time, the answer was no. But the frost did what pride could not. It told the truth in public. So here's what I want to leave you with. Somewhere in your life right now, there may be a person others have already dismissed. Too young, too quiet, too different, too far outside the room where decisions get made. And every once in a while, that is exactly the person seeing the problem clearly while everybody else is busy laughing. Naomi Carter painted apple trees white. People mocked her. Then the frost came, and the same people who laughed had to watch her orchard prove she was right. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me below. Have you ever been the one people doubted, only to prove them wrong in the end? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now, because the next story is about another person the world underestimated right up until it couldn't anymore. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.